Okay, so that last case wasn't so far off from reality. Last year, we saw the first landmark neurodata judgment against a US neurotech company. A Chilean senator who had a hand in drafting a neuro rights amendment to their constitution decided to put it to the test. So he purchased his consumer neurotech device. He consented to the privacy agreement. He consented to have his data stored and processed on the cloud so that he could receive services. After all, that's the only way he could receive services. And then he tried to pull a copy of his data. But when he tried to do that, he couldn't because he didn't have a premium subscription. At that point, he didn't revoke his consent. He sued. He sued for violations against his exceptional rights to his brain data, and he won. Just a few months ago, in the US, we saw the first neurodata bill passed in the state of Colorado. We see another coming on its heels in California, likely very soon. And if you said, so what? Come see us at 2:15, because we have a breakout group where we'll discuss that in more detail, and we really want to hear your thoughts. But what you're seeing here is a manifestation of just how exceptional the brain is, not just biologically, but culturally. Society is asking us, they're demanding not only engineering innovation, but ethical innovation and ethical leadership. And it's likely that ethical leadership, or lack thereof, that's going to make or break this field. We don't want this field to break. This is an amazing field. You've been hearing tear-jerking feats of accomplishment all day today. Look to your left and your right. According to the recent Lancet report, 1 of the 3 of you has a neurological disorder or will. Look around at the room. Half of you will experience, according to the World Health Organization, a mental illness. These are technologies we must see thrive. They must come to fruition. We have an ethical obligation to make sure they come into play. But being ethical doesn't come just with being compliant, right? Compliance isn't enough here. We have a checkered history with neurotechnologies, right? With neuroscience. Think of lobotomies. Think of amphetamines being used in warfighters. Think of mental health diagnosis being used as a tool of social control. That still happens, right? And as societies are changing, we hope they transform for the better. We need to change the status quo, we know, but there's new questions that come up, such as, and I'll remind you, the technologies won't just stay in the clinic, right? They're going to move out to the broader public, and actually that's something we want. We want a benefit for everyone. But some of these new questions come up, such as, who am I in relation to my device? We see some patients talk about having their humanity restored. You've seen some patients that have that, right? But others report feeling like an electric doll. They wonder if they're the authors or narrators of their lives anymore. And what counts as sick, normal, or enhanced as a moving target? What we didn't talk a lot about today were predictive neurotechnologies that predict brain health and diseases. And a prediction like that doesn't predict just what you're going to have, it predicts who you're going to become. And early intervention could either flatten out neurodiversity, pathologize disenfranchised groups who are typically underrepresented in these data sets, or perhaps it can celebrate it. And what does mental privacy mean anymore when you can directly link into the brain and understand thoughts, perhaps, or remnants of that in decision making? Do laws or will laws protect where the skull no longer can? And where should these technologies be deployed? Should they be used in the workforce, as we talked about, in school children, in political campaigns? They've been used in all 3. So with the history that we've seen of neurotechnology evolving, with the history with lobotomies, with the history of Cambridge Analytica and Theranos, these are things that we need to prepare for. History has told us we need to be looking ethically ahead. And there is a field called neuroethics dedicated to the ethical, legal, and social implications of neuroscience. And we believe that a practical, applied neuroethics by design approach is what can enhance and deliver this future of ethical technology for everyone. When creating guidelines for any of these technologies, for any emerging technologies, we suffer from something called the pacing problem. The pacing problem is that laws basically are too slow to keep up with the speed of technology. And what we typically see in this case is governance scholars call for kind of a complementary approach. That is hard law, which are enforceable regulation, and soft law, which are ethical guidance, for example. And Ethical guidance and soft law actually can be useful because it can be agile, adaptable, and piloted with communities of practice, and then those best practices can be hardened into regulation, for example. And we know that we have a number of places where we need actionable ethics guidance in this space, such as for the use of brain data. What's appropriate third-party use? We haven't talked a lot about this at all, but AI-enabled neurotech, many of us were just at the AI for Good Summit talking about the blind spots and gaps there, particularly around machine learning and large language LLMs. And applications, what counts as misuse, where are applications for enhancement, user autonomy. One thing we didn't talk about was long-term responsibility for implanted devices. Many of you know about Second Sight, perhaps. The company was sold. Patients who were enjoying that device, who were restoring some level of sight, faced the prospect of becoming blind again. And then end user engagement. How do we create equitable access? And I know many companies here are working on trying to make that possible. So as Diana shared, and because now we're all friends now, we moved around and patted our butts and everything together, I will share with you that I tell my friends I'm a recovering academic. So I spent a long time in the lab. I was a bench scientist working on neurodegeneration, aging, and then working on understanding how deep brain stimulation works. And it was those thorny ethical issues that propelled me into, at the time, a new field called neuroethics. And I spent about a decade running one of the leading neuroethics programs in the world and as a professor of neurology and psychiatry. And I wrote lots of these kinds of guidance. In our lab did analysis, there's not as many as AI guidance, but there's some good amount. There's over 20. I'll just show of hands. Any of you, maybe you can't see, but I'll say, any of you heard of, used the UNESCO guidelines recommendation? What about OECD's? Okay. What about from the Brain Initiatives? Brain Initiative has some principles, roadmap. Okay. Oh, look around. I know that most of you don't use these. I know that you don't use them, and there's a reason why you don't use them. How do you translate? They're these really broad, non-controversial concepts like protect, avoid misuse, protect privacy. But in the end, how do you implement that? And the lack of implementation is a symptom of the process, which did not involve people who needed to be there most in the conversations. That's companies who are ultimately facing this translation to scaling gap. They know precisely how they might address and when these pain points are going to arise during their process. They could tell us how to implement. Also, surprisingly missing are patients and their families. These are things that academics and policymakers writing these guidances may not realize. They may not realize their pain points. So, an existing regulation that is in place now, it's in early stages, but has already been critiqued by practicing physicians who say this might prevent me from offering standards of care as they exist. This might also prevent us from being able to collaborate across universities. And digital rights activists say these laws do too little and too much at the same time and might restrict access for us to these technologies. So this is not to say that we don't want these types of ethics guidances. We do need these things in place, but they need to be able to be practically implemented. And with just how difficult you've heard it is for companies to translate and scale and raise capital and suffer through that, we have an obligation to make sure that tools are simple, practical, relevant in the real world and going to work in their workflows. And for this reason, that is why I left academia to dedicate my full time to co-creating these tools. And I'm extremely grateful to BrainMind, who have been critical partners in this process and had the foresight, as they always do, to identify gaps and see that it was going to be neuroethics tools that would advance and accelerate these technologies in sustainable ways and ethical ways. And I had the pleasure of working in a partnership as an embedded neuroethicist in companies to try to co-create these tools. And I'll share with you a neuroethics playbook, a 4-part neuroethics playbook for startups. The first, and we have tools and templates for this. The first is a neuroethics charter. Every company needs to have an ethics charter. This is just basic. You need to have your values outlined, and you need to have your values outlined how they're going to impact your decision-making throughout your day-to-day, and how you would do that across teams. You don't want to be doing that in a crisis moment. The second tool is a neuroethics advisory board. So we have a pool of skilled neuroethicists, but many of them actually don't know how to work in this space. So what we've developed is a roles and responsibilities sheet for how you might be able to leverage your board, just like we struggle to leverage any board, right? And then the third is a way to deal with external partnerships. So I see many companies when they're at a phase, at their next phase of growth, they have new partnerships. They're wondering how they're going to maintain the integrity of the applications of the use of their technologies, but they also want to explore them. So we've developed a partner rubric. It's really a conversation tool and a rubric where you can screen partners early on. And we've also developed something that's a little bit more contractual. It's an acceptable use policy that delineates acceptable and unacceptable uses for your product, for your platform, that can be integrated into your terms and conditions. And finally, once you have all these great tools, you need an accountability plan. So we've created a responsibility map. It's important here that most companies have a legal counsel, but you are unlikely to have an ethics counsel. And like I said, being compliant doesn't mean you're going to be ethical. And so, and really, ethics shouldn't be one person's job. So we've created a map that breaks out the individual ethics commitments and how they align with specific roles in the company, whether it's CEO, CTO, product manager, et cetera. And there's more tools that I'd like to talk with you about to develop, but I won't have time to do that today. And these include UX that integrates ethics and other data processes and audits. So finally, I'll close with saying that ultimately what we need here is community co-design. Every company in this space, every investor in this space is going to need to be ethically ready and regulatory ready. And if I have one ask of this community, it's related to some of the work we did with the 100 some odd community members from the BrainMind ecosystem. They asked for these tools, which we're on our way to developing, but they also asked for exemplars. And we're hoping that we can have early ethics adopters, investors, companies, researchers in this space who are willing to critique these tools, who are willing to upgrade these tools, who are willing to co-create ideas for new tools that others can use. And we also hope to debut those in Asilomar. There's a number of community efforts. Lee mentioned the IBCI Community Collaboratory. We're also hosting a Neuroethics Hackathon in Vienna in the coming months. And we believe that it's this collaboration and this collective wisdom that's going to drive an ethical future of neurotechnology for everyone. Thank you.